Hello all, I hope you are having a fabulous day. My name is Reggie and today I'll be sharing with you my September and October wrap-up. The first book I read in September is Blood Promise by Rochelle Mead. This is the fourth book in the Vampire Academy series, and I really enjoyed this one too. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, which is actually, I believe, the lowest rating I've given to a Vampire Academy book yet. One was still really good, but it took the story in such a different direction, and it's opening up a very different arc than the first half of the series was, that it just took some adjustment, and that ending really crushed me. I haven't picked up the 5th or 6th books in the series yet, but I do plan on reading them before the year is out because I just absolutely love this series. After that, I read Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. This is, of course, a reread for me. I listened to this on an audiobook, and this is one of, if not my all-time favorite Harry Potter books. This book was so good, and this reread really solidified for me why I love this book and reminded me what makes this book so great for me. And it does a lot for the story, and there's so much development here, and we get a huge growth from Harry and the world and the characters, and Dumbledore's army is in this. Next up was another audiobook, and this was another reread for me, and this was An Ember in the Ashes by Saba Tahir. This book is a great audiobook, so if you're interested in picking up a wonderful audiobook, highly recommend this one. This is a story set in a very Roman-inspired world, and in the story we follow 2 characters. Our main protagonist is Leia, and she is a scholar, one of the working class. In the beginning of the story, she suffers a tragedy, and in order to overcome this tragedy and kind of help with the ramifications of this tragedy, she finds a rebellious group and disguises herself as a slave within basically the enemy school. Our second perspective follows one of those students from that enemy school who is not very well aligned with the ideals and the world that has been built up in this school of his. So they're from different sides of the world, but they have kind of a common ground, and our story picks up as they kind of meet each other in this school. It's very action-packed, very interesting. I did reread this. I read this when it came out last year. I only kind of liked it when I read it. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars last time. This time I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. I found the characters to be more complex than I thought they were. I found the story to be more engaging than I remembered it, and I really found a lot of lines that I really enjoyed. So I found the writing to be a lot more beautiful, and I think that's the thing that really did it for me, is the writing, and there's these specific lines of dialogue that are just so well crafted that I just loved. And I really thank the narrators of the audiobook for bringing that to light to me, and the way they read these words and the way they expressed this dialogue. I think it was very well done. Next up, I read My Grandmother Asked Me to Tell You She's Sorry by Frederick Bachman. I was sent this book to review by BookTube Tours, and I did do that review, so I'll link it in the eye if you're interested, but I absolutely adore this book. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. This tells the story of Eliza, who is 7 years old. She is very, very close with her grandmother. Very soon after the story begins, her grandmother dies, and one of her grandmother's last wish was to deliver this letter to someone. And Eliza goes on this quest of delivering these letters on her grandmother's behalf. And it's a story of her grief and her grieving process and learning more about her grandma. And I read this at a time where I had just lost my grandpa, and it just really connected to me in a very special place. If you have a really close relationship with your grandparents or either of your grandparents, I would highly recommend this book. It really touched all the heartstrings, and I definitely cried, but it was also a very emotionally healing process for me personally. I did really love this. One of my favorite books I've read this year. Next up, I read the 3 short stories from the Harry Potter short story collection. The first one I read is called Short Stories from Hogwarts of Power, Politics, and Pesty Poltergeists, and I gave this one, I believe, 3 out of 5 stars, yes. Then I read Hogwarts, An Incomplete and Unreliable Guide, and I gave this one 3 stars as well. And then the last one I read, Short Stories from Hogwarts of Heroism, Hardship, and Dangerous Hobbies. This one was my favorite. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I think this one tells the story of characters a little bit more. We do get more of a story, while the other ones were more like lists and itemized responses and notes. They weren't short stories. And here's the thing. We love J.K. Rowling and we love Hogwarts. If these would have been marketed right, if we would have just been told, hey, this is what this is, these are kind of more notes than stories, we probably would have still bought them and been excited and been pumped. And what hurt us is that these were marketed as short stories and they weren't that, and that's just misguided and misleading. The next thing I read in September was on writing a memoir of the craft by Stephen King. This is his memoir / tips on being a writer. While I've never read a lot of Stephen King's work, I really admire what he's done, not only for the horror genre, but just in writing so much. And I think he's had such a unique but great career, and he's so iconic that I definitely hugely respect what he has to say about writing. So I was really excited to pick this up. I did listen to this as an audiobook narrated by Stephen King, which was so great. Highly recommend reading this book via audiobook from Stephen King because it was so much more interesting and kind of helpful. Hearing him give the advice, I really, really liked that. Then I listened to another audiobook because I was obsessed with audiobooks in September. Apparently, I listened to Charlotte's Web by E.B. White, and this was so good. Charlotte's Web tells the story of a pig named Wilbur who is taken to a farm and is growing up and learning the world of the farm, and he befriends a spider, and the spider helps him kind of get out of a funk. I really, really love this. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read another book for BookTube Tours. This is Forget Tomorrow by Pentip Dunn, and I did review this. I think I gave this book 2.5 or 3 stars out of 5. I did really enjoy the concept of this. This is a dystopian story in which memories are sent back into the past when a person turns, I think, 16. And those memories kind of propel their future because it tells kind of a snippet of what's going to happen in the future. Our protagonist is named Callie, and Callie gets her memory. And it turns out Callie is going to kill her younger sister, who she's super close with. It doesn't make any sense. And Callie then decides to turn herself in. And that's kind of where our story progresses, and we learn more about this dystopian society and this world, which is obviously not all it seems. And the story progresses from there. It's a very interesting concept. I think I had issues with insta-love and character development, a little bit with the writing, but it does have a sequel, and the publishers did also send me the sequel, and I'm really excited to read the sequel. So I think that still says something about the quality of the story. Next up, I read The Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson. This is the second book in the Mistborn trilogy, and I really, really, really enjoyed this book. I gave this book a 4 out of 5 stars. Quality follow-up to the first book. What I really love about Brandon Sanderson's worlds and books is, besides that they are these vastly well-constructed fantasy worlds, and they're still easy to take in and understand, it's also that he has these characters go through these very real and nice and interesting arcs, and that he lets time pass between his stories. It's just really interesting to see the progression of a character. Next up, in September, I read A Torch Against the Night by Sabaa Tahir. This is the sequel to An Ember in the Ashes. I gave this a 4.75 stars. I liked this more than An Ember in Ashes, which is a very unpopular opinion, but I really liked the way the story progressed. I can't tell you a lot about it because it is a sequel. It does take off immediately after where the first one ends, like immediately after. I highly recommend reading these back to back because they flow so nicely together. The character arcs are great. I love the progression of the characters and the journey they take, the emotional progress they feel, and the villain in the story is so wonderful. Next up, I read As I Descended by Robin Talley. This is a Macbeth retelling, and it is so good. It is chock full of beautiful diversity. Our main character is in a female-female relationship. She is also of Hispanic descent. Our other main character, the one she is in a relationship with, is disabled. We have a best friend who is overweight and also of Mexican descent, and he is in a male-male relationship. His boyfriend is bisexual. There is so much diversity in this book. It is glorious. I love that. I love the Macbeth retelling. I loved the Shakespeare parallels and the way the story progressed and talked about Shakespeare's concepts in a high school setting. I did give it 4 out of 5 stars, so there were some things that were lacking for me, and a lot of them honestly are because I'm such a Shakespeare snob. While that's being said, this book did so much for Macbeth and this story, and presenting it in a new light and presenting it to a new audience. and I loved it so much. The next book I read is the last book I read in September, and that is Like a River Glorious by Ray Carson. Ray Carson, as you know, is my favorite author. This is the sequel to Walk on Earth, a Stranger. It's the second book in the Gold Seer trilogy, and this trilogy is about our main character, Leah Westfall, who is living in the gold rush era. She is living in the South, and she has this ability to sense gold. And after tragedy strikes at the beginning of the story, she decides to flee and head west. So the first story is her journey west to California, and the second book is her stay in California in the gold rush, and it is so good. Ray Carson did not hold back, which is undoubtedly my favorite thing about Ray Carson. There is trouble in the world, and she will tell it to you. Next up, we are into the October reads. The first book I read in October was The End, the 13th book in a series of unfortunate events. This was a wildly disappointing conclusion. It was bad. I gave it 2 stars. Well, these things that were built up weren't really fleshed out or dealt with very much, and that's not what you want in a 13-book series. Next up, I read Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur. I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. Kaur writes amazing, amazing concepts. She has amazing messages. But I find the language and the way it's written too simplistic to really feel like poetry. It feels more like freeform thoughts on a page. And that was really distracting while reading it. I did really enjoy a lot of it. After that, I listened to another audiobook, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince by J.K. Rowling. I loved this reread. I really dislike Snape, so the focus on Snape and the things Snape did in this book annoyed me the first time I read it. But it made me sad, and I didn't like it as much, and it wasn't my go-to. See the error of my ways. I see how important this book is to the series as a whole. It was just very good. Sassy Harry is my favorite also, and he is in full form in this book. It was a great reread, and of course it's 5 out of 5 stars because it's Harry Potter. After that, I read Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, and I honestly don't know how people describe this book. I know it's got a lot of pictures, which are pretty cool, and the pictures help tell a story, which is a very unique and a wonderful medium. I love the way Ransom Riggs put the story together. However, I didn't love the story by any means. I think I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I think that was generous. I did not enjoy the story very much. I think I'm going to unhaul it. I think I might not even continue on with the series. Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children by Ransom Riggs does tell the story of our main character, whose name I forgot, Jacob. Jacob is living in the world, our regular old world, when his grandpa dies, and he finds out that he is actually part of a very unique group of people called the Peculiars. Mystery ensues, story ensues, adventure ensues. I can see why people love this book. It just really wasn't for me. Next up, my friends, I read The Unbecoming of Mara Dyer. If you don't know, Mara Dyer is one of my favorite trilogies of all time. This is a story about a girl named Mara Dyer. At the beginning of the story, she has just woken up from an accident that has killed her best friend, her boyfriend, and a friend/acquaintance. This book takes you through her story after that as she deals with PTSD. A lot of what we're seeing in this book is questions of, is what she's seeing paranormal and supernatural, or is what's happening to her part of the PTSD she is suffering from? And it is so good. I didn't think the reread would be as good as it is. 5 out of 5 stars. The next one is Bandit Volume 3, The House of the Green Mask. I'm so happy. Bandit is one of my favorite comic books. It is about a cute little French girl who is a superhero. Her superpower is presto. She doesn't save the world. She saves artifacts from people who are going to steal them and gives them back to museums. She's a very Robin Hood-esque character. I love her to pieces. This was a wonderful addition to her story. Next up, I read The Scorpio Races by Maggie Stiefvater. Listen to this as an audiobook. The guy who narrates this book is the same guy who narrates Ember and the Ashes and Torch Against the Night, and he is like probably my new favorite. This is the story of the Scorpio Races. The Scorpio Races are an event that occurs that are very dangerous in this world. Basically, a bunch of riders take water horses who are very violent and scary, honestly, and they ride them in a very vicious race. And this story follows Chuck, who is a girl who's the first girl to ever compete in the Scorpio Races, as well as Sean, who is a returning champion. And both of them have very high stakes in this race and reasons they need to win, and we root for both of them. And it's just beautiful and wonderful. I love the story. I already can't wait to reread it. It's so so invigorating and exciting, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And the last book I read in October was Every Heart a Doorway by Shauna Maguire. This book is a story about a bunch of different children who have come back from their worlds, who have gone through closet doors to other worlds, the Alice in Wonderlands of the world, the Children of Narnia in this world, and they have come back for one reason or another and are distraught, and they hurt because they're no longer in a world that feels like it's theirs, and their parents, thinking that they're obviously manifesting these ideas, send them to a therapy boarding school, which is actually a rehabilitation center for a bunch of kids who have actually gone on these quests to other worlds. And it's a very interesting concept. Honestly, it was good. It was interesting. The concept, I feel like, is more than the story was, though. Has some great diversity in it, and I really appreciated that. It lacked in substance and writing for me, and it just wasn't what it was held up to be to me. But that is all for today's video, so I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, you should subscribe. I'll see you in my next video. Bye!